fun.
Thank you, Marcos, for what you shared. I loved you speaking about how, particularly raising up the situation of churches that do not have property. I think that's, you know, we're going to talk today about affordable housing, and that's what we do as a congregational land committee. But there are so many missional ways to use property, and my own 2 cents certainly are that one of the most missional things that we can do is to, for a congregation that is shrinking, that is maybe closing, is to, bequeath that property, right, to another ministry that is preaching the gospel more effectively, that is living out the Christian faith in a new and different way. And that may very well may be an immigrant congregation, most typically. So thank you for bringing that up. And then I also wanted to just kind of go back to what Jill was saying as well about the about how being with this group of authors really created a learning community. And I very much felt that. And I do want to bring up as well that, all of this is all of those of us who are involved in this work of supporting churches as they think through property redevelopment, downsizing. This is a pretty new industry. Now, big caveat to that, in the Black church particularly, there has been a much longer history over several decades of doing community development type work in the church and real estate development as part of that. But in the broader church, this is really quite new. Paige just mentioned maybe 6 years that she's been working on it, and us, I know 5 years that we have been working on this. This is a new sort of field, and the best practices are still emerging. And therefore having a learning community is really important. And I want to say that not only for those of us who are involved in the book and those who are involved kind of at the national level, but for those of us here in the Los Angeles area too, it's really, I really, want to invite us all to form part of that learning community. And you know what? There is enough work here for everybody. In chapter 1 of the book, Eileen Lindner gives an estimation of the scope of the problem. How many church properties could be sold or, redeveloped over from, until 2030. And she estimates that at about 100,000 church properties. So with 100,000 church properties, there's plenty enough room for lots of people to get involved. There's enough room, I think, for some different methodologies and different practices related to church land redevelopment. All right, so as we've been discussing with this team of authors, in the sort of theology parts of this, we get to think a lot about the kind of what should be, and about what we want to be, what is the best expression of us as Christians. And yet we have to hold that in the same hand, or like hold in the other hand as we're doing that. Everybody also realized that when you get into real estate development, it is not with your eyes shut. It was with your eyes wide open. It is a dog eat dog world in commercial real estate, and you need to be ready for that. And you need to be able to defend yourself and protect yourself in real estate transactions, or you will get taken advantage of. And so that is really the That's really kind of the genesis for our chapter, mine, Jill's, and Andre's. And to illustrate that point, I'm going to read the beginning of our chapter, which talks about two uh, two different stories, two congregations that we've worked with in the local area, but which shall remain nameless. Their names have been changed for the purposes of the book. And but it'll kind of illustrate what kinds of things happen with real estate development and church property. First story is called A Portrait in the Lobby. Trinity Presbyterian Church had dreamed the dream, responding to their neighborhood's systemic disinvestment and abandonment. They had filled their hearts with a vision of quality housing, community gardens, and a revitalized community they could be proud to grow old in. This would happen through a new mixed-use project with 58 units of senior affordable housing on church property, generating community development and church renewal. Reverend Johnson had worked hard on the project for years, preaching and teaching about the social and community dimensions of the gospel. And now that congregation would greet his frequent references to the project with hearty amens. During coffee hour, they would privately speculate which church members would get the apartments. As the framers and concrete pourers gave way to the painters and cabinet makers, community builders, the developer, made its first mention of the word lottery on page 18 of a monthly project status report given to the church. A few months later, the church secretary took note. What exactly was to be given away in the lottery? And who could participate? Reverend Johnson and the elders anxiously discussed the issue. The developer had implied during the negotiations to acquire the property that the church's elderly members would be the first ones eligible to rent units. The reality only surfaced later. Apartments in the new affordable housing development would be open to the public, and their residents chosen by lottery. And the seniors from the church would have to compete for housing like every other applicant. In the end, 986 applications were received for the initial lottery. None of the church's members were ultimately selected. The church had donated its land for zero economic consideration, and it invested $35,000 of its own money in the project because of a false understanding that the church's members would have first opportunity to lease apartments in the building. Instead, all they received was a portrait of Reverend Johnson in the lobby. Story 2. Is that the only option? The Congregational Church of Eden Highlands had been known for decades in their small but influential community for their principled stance on social justice. Their board of trustees, composed of professors, real estate agents, and nonprofit executives, had always enjoyed finding ways to care for those on the underside of their otherwise exclusive town: the unhoused, street musicians, hotel maids, nannies, and gardeners. And yet, ministry could not continue in the same way forever. The church had been declining for decades, and in 3 years, the operating fund would be depleted, and the church would cease to exist. For the church to remain in the community for the long term, its mission would have to be redefined and property monetized. The trustees were faced with a question of faith. Would they pursue affordable housing development that truly embodied their values for the community? Or would they sell for McMansions or a high-end hotel? Complicating this decision was the town of Eden Highlands' notoriously strict zoning code, which required a conditional use permit, an action that required an up or down vote by the city council, for all construction of apartments. And the town was tightening these codes even further in response to a strong movement of angry citizens gathering petitions for a ballot measure to require a citywide vote before allowing any apartment, condominium, or hotel project. The trustees reached out to a commercial developer, friendly to the church, to discuss their options and agreed to perform a feasibility study. After a few months, a lengthy volume came back, stating that single-family homes were the most viable option, with hotel as a risky but lucrative alternative. The developer ruled out affordable housing, citing the city's conditional use permit requirement and stating that it would not provide sufficient operating income to save the church. Having engaged his firm's architects and engineers, of course, the developer sent the church a bill of $150,000 for the feasibility study. However, he said he would conveniently forego payment if the church would let his firm build the project. A couple of days from signing on the dotted line, the president of the trustees frantically sought out a team of affordable housing advisors for assistance. This group guided the church in an inside-outside advocacy strategy for a reimagined church campus with the majority of the land earmarked for an affordable housing development. The trustees used their existing relationships and respect they had earned to hail elected officials to meetings and site tours. At the same time, the advisors wrote letters to the state of California, leveraging its housing element process to challenge the validity of the conditional use permit requirement. The strategy ultimately worked and obligated the town to allow a minimum of 75 units on the site. This allowed the trustees and advisory team to consider 4 options: an easy to permit luxury single family option, an affordable option that would preserve the sanctuary and demolish the education building, the reverse of that option, preserve the education building and demolish the sanctuary, and a final option to wipe the entire site clean and replace it with affordable housing and a modern gathering place, physically expressing the church's desire to become a spiritual center, welcoming expressions of faith from a variety of religious traditions. After the advisory team helped the church evaluate the financial, physical, and political pros and cons of each alternative, the preferred affordable housing alternative was selected. They created a request for proposals to pitch to potential affordable housing developers. 4 excellent proposals were received, top among them a well-known for-profit affordable housing development firm that committed almost $10 million in milestone payments to the church for an affordable housing development of 75 to 100 units. So these 2 stories illustrate why we decided to create this advisory team, the Congregational Land Committee, that you all know that we work as a part of. And in our chapter, we continue on to highlight kind of 4 key principles of working with an advisory team, or even for those professionals who are interested, forming your own advisory team. As mentioned, there is so much work in this area. There's so much space for more people, and we would love to see the movement continue to grow. The first principle, and coming straight out of what we talked about here, is that churches need competent and sympathetic advisors who guide them in envisioning, partnering, and executing development projects without a conflict of interest. First important thing to talk about here, I think, is competent and sympathetic advisors, and that the churches need them. So this in the second story, the Congregational Church of Eden Highlands, they had a commercial developer in their midst, among the church membership or close friend of the church, and they reached out to him to see if he could do the feasibility study for them. Well, we see many churches that have maybe realtors in their church, and they send these folks off to see if they can do affordable housing development. But unfortunately, that really doesn't work because affordable housing development is a very specialized field. And if you don't, if you, the fact that you understand how to sell a house, or even that you understand how to build a commercial real estate project or even a market rate housing project, doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to entitle and finance and build affordable housing. So it's really critical that if affordable housing is the direction that your church is going, that you have advisors who are skilled in this particular area. And, what we're about is that we work for the church. We are an advisor to the church, not to a developer, and we don't have a conflict of interest. So we don't take money from developers. We're not beholden to a particular one or small group of developers. It's important, we think, for the members, for the advisors to be impartial and really represent the interests of the church throughout the process, because the developers are experts at this and they will be able to represent their own interests, and they'll surround themselves as well with lawyers and others to defend their own interests in the deal as well. Second principle, churches should be empowered to help their vision become reality, as well as meet their needs and interests. So, the typical thing that happens is that a developer has an idea of what they want to do on the site, and they just come in kind of cold. They kind of cold call the church and they just say, hey, I want to get, sell me your land and I'm going to build whatever my vision is for this. And, obviously it depends on who the developer is. That might be something good for the neighborhood or not so good for the neighborhood. But ideally, we really think that churches should be empowered to develop their own vision and help it become reality. Why? A, the church owns the land, so de facto it is the church that has that right. B, churches, we should be organizations that are about taking care of the needs of the neighborhood, that are connected to the neighborhood, that have a strong, robust spirituality around, the diversity of human needs and also the needs of communities. And churches should be able to speak more closely to the needs of their community than an outside developer. Third principle, rather than knocking on doors, an advisory team should allow congregations to seek out advisory services. This is just because of what I just mentioned before. There's so much mistrust, sorry, of kind of receiving cold calls from people interested in your land, that if an advisory team just reaches out kind of cold to congregations, they're likely to generate that same mistrust. So we rely on word of mouth and referrals and a few sort of introductory events, basically to introduce people to who we are and let them come to us. And the fourth principle, there are no cookie cutter solutions that work for all churches. One real estate axiom that you probably do know, and that is real, is location, location, location. So depending on the location of your property and all of the unique characteristics about who your church is, what you want to accomplish, what buildings you have on the site, historic, what you want to keep in your property, every project is going to be very unique. And I think that means that, for a church, it's not about simply just copying somebody else, but you do need a team of advisors on your side that can help you think through the nuances and the particulars of your project so that you're ready to partner to develop. So that's sort of an overview of our chapter, and I hope that you enjoy it. Hope that you enjoy reading this book and all the wonderful things that are in it. And I will pass it off at this point. I will invite up Andre to speak more about his experiences related to affordable housing deals in churches.